My whole time of growing up was learning about the war and the events that my parents underwent from other people. Very, very little did I learn about their personal experiences from them. They were hurting. They had a great deal of pain in resolving. They lost all their families. So as a child growing up, I discovered about the war from others. As a young adult, I made it my business to learn as much as I could from my parents. But again, it was like pulling teeth. One thing that I did learn is that my birth was planned to be a statement. I was born April 20th, 1947 in Bamberg, Germany, in a displaced persons camp as my parents were trying to find a place to live around the world. And I was originally supposed to be born a couple days earlier, but back then they weren't always sure. But my mother, who was a concentration camp survivor, lost her entire family, and she was going to make a statement. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was made the chancellor in Germany, and his birthday, April 20th, became a national holiday all the way through 1945. Right? My mother decided that if she survived and had a child born on April 20th, that was her way of spitting in his face. And sure enough, I was born on April 20th. My mother didn't stop there, though. 13 years later, she made sure that my sister was also born on April 20th. So she spit in both his eyes.
For nearly 2,000 years, Jews and Christians have been divided. But now, God is calling for the healing of past hurts and the comforting of His people. Discover how God is prophetically uniting Jews and Christians across the world today on The Crossover. And now, here is your host, Mitch Jerome.
With Simon Wellner, past president of Temple Beth Torah. And Simon's going to share on, Simon's also second generation child of Holocaust survivors. And he's going to share with us just some of the highlights of parents' life, his life, what it's like to be a child of a survivor, and what does that mean? How do we relate to that compared to traditional families, as we call traditional? Yours is far from traditional, Simon. So fill us in on, give us a little synopsis of mom and dad and you being raised in a displacement camp.
My mother is one of two of a family of 11 that survived. My father is one of 5. He's the only one in his family that survived. My father was first captured in 1939 as a member of the Polish Army. And they put him in a prisoner of war camp. And then they discovered he was Jewish. All right, so they took him out of the prisoner of war camp, but he had some unique skills, so he got put into a work camp, all right, where he was young, he was strong, he was going to work. All right. My mother also had some very unique skills. She was very skilled in preparing food from very little in the way of edible items, and she became involved in a work camp and in the kitchen, all right, learning how to make something that was edible out of potato scraps, something edible out of a variety of things that could be foraged because the Germans didn't provide. They worked in a number of work camps, and towards the end of the war, they both were moved into concentration camps. And fortunately, my father was in a camp that he was released in January of '45. He went back to Poland and looked and looked and looked for his family, couldn't find any, and eventually started to look for people from his neighborhood in Poland, and found some of those and heard the stories, so that on May 8th, when my mother was released from Gross Rosen, her work camp, he was outside the gates waiting for her. And together they rounded up all their friends and so forth and went back to try to, again, find family, and couldn't find any surviving family. They got involved in the Survivors Network, right? But the Polish army discovered that my dad was a former Polish army member and told him he had to go back and serve in the Polish army because there were pockets of Germans that needed to be eradicated. All right? And Dad said, "What are you, crazy? I survived 6 years of camps, and now you want me to go back at the end of the war and get out these?" So he said, "Here's your gun, goodbye." All right? And they found their way into an American camp, all right, American soldiers, and with a little help from a Jewish chaplain serving with, they ended up in Bamberg, Germany, in a displaced persons camp. And a lot of their friends were in that camp, and they made new friends because they all had something in common. They were displaced persons camp who couldn't get to Israel, couldn't get resettled elsewhere in Europe, and couldn't get to the United States without a little bit of help. In 1946, my parents got married, and shortly thereafter my mother conceived. And in April 20th of 1947, I came into the world as
Displacement camp.
in the displacements camp, as was common in those displacements camp. There was a lot of sharing that went on. All right? Some women went out and worked, and some women stayed home to take care of the children. And there were lots of children that were born in these camps after the war.
Now, how old, till what age did you stay in a displacement camp?
I stayed in Bamberg till I was 4 years old.
Give us an idea of what life was like in a camp, displacement camp. I mean, where did you live? Was these tents? Were these apartments? Was this real rugged? Stores?
The American Army had a small base just outside of Bamberg, and my father had joined the American Army and became a mechanic in the motor pool. He joined the American Army with the hopes that maybe he could be sent to America as a GI, or as an ex-GI. Well, it didn't work out quite that way, but what did happen is he met some other people in the Army that were American citizens, and a couple of them were American Jews. And he kept in contact with them, so that in 1954, they sponsored us to come to America. And we landed in the good old Jewish town of New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford is a small whaling town. From New Bedford, where there were no Jews, we went up the road a bit and ended up in New Haven, Connecticut, right, which is where you find Yale today. It was there then too, but my mother thought that would inspire me to go on to higher education. My mother had my life planned out. And
you had two choices, though, didn't you? A doctor or a lawyer?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Then we moved to Detroit, where my dad got to work in a machine shop of Ford Motor Company, which is very interesting because Henry Ford was a noted anti-Semite, but fortunately he didn't care who worked in his machine shops as long as they produced.
You're watching The Crossover. This is with Simon Wellner. We'll be back in a moment, hear more from Simon and being raised in a displacement camp. And here's a brief view of one of our other shows with Henry Ford.
We will be right back.
And what happened? What was going on?
Well, probably the 1920s and definitely the 30s was the darkest time in American history for the Jewish people. And I attribute that to the change an atmosphere to one man, Henry Ford. He sincerely believed it, that the Jew was the cause of all the world's problems, that World War I was caused by the Jews, that communism was caused by the Jews, the Great Depression was caused by the Jews.
And does this attitude carry over with his kids today that run the business?
I'm glad you mentioned that. No, his son, well, of course his son died early, but his grandson reversed that. He went to the Jewish population and he apologized and said he had nothing to do with his father and what his father had done.
Great.
So yeah, Henry, the Ford Motor Company no longer is like that.
So take us back to Henry Ford and some of, he took this attitude and put his power, his influence, his money to action. And
yes,
what
he
are some of
did.
the things that he did?
Yes, he did. You have to realize now, back in the 1920s and 30s, Henry Ford is one of the greatest Americans. I mean, he's really looked up to. And so when he went on this crusade, it affected a lot of people. And what he did was he bought a newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan to be his voice of anti-Semitism. And when the paper first started, he ran 52 weeks of the International Jew, the World's Worst Problem, non-stop, 52 weeks. And he used his Ford distributorship as a way of promoting the newspaper. And also, if you bought a Ford vehicle, you got a subscription. And it got so severe that at one point, the former president of the United States, the current president of the United States, and it turns out the future president of the United States denounced him for what he was doing.
Taft, Harding, and Wilson. Huh?
Taft, Harding, and Wilson. And also a Booth from the Salvation Army. She came out and defended the Jews in light of what Ford was doing. So there was two things here, Mitch. Let me explain.
Okay.
There's the newspaper, which he ran that headline, International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Then he put together a book called, with the same title. And then the book was extremely popular, millions of copies sold, and unfortunately it was extremely popular in Germany, and it greatly inspired Adolf Hitler. And Hitler, he had a picture of Henry Ford hanging in his office, and if Hitler was meeting with someone, he would then give it to him as a gift. That's the influence that Henry Ford had, not only in America, but worldwide.
Welcome back to The Crossover.
You're watching The Crossover. Today we're sharing with, Simon Wellner sharing with us on being raised in a displacement camp. Parents had gone through the horrific trauma of being in concentration camps. Simon, pick up where you left off there on community life.
We finally settled in Detroit, where my father was working in a machine shop for Henry Ford and helping make Ford automobiles. My dad became involved in a number of small groups that were consistently survivors and people who had experienced things similar to what he experienced. And they talked about their pain and their difficulties, and they talked about their kids. And I got to know a number of these kids, and we kind of compared notes. We found that discipline in our homes was very, very strict. There was very, very little room for deviation. Our days were very structured. We up and about, eating breakfast, lunch, dinners, and so forth, and that kind of thing. And very, very little room for deviation. Because my parents knew a structure that they learned in the camps. This is when you got up, this is when you ate, this is how long you worked, this is when lights out, this is when you went to bed, and this is what they knew and what they thought was appropriate for raising children, discipline. Right? And so being the oldest, I bore the brunt of a great deal of discipline. I probably cost my dad 3 or 4 straps. All right. I know my middle sister probably wore out one of his straps. All right. And my youngest sister, Pam, who was exactly 13 years younger than I, benefited from what they learned as they raised us and how they learned from some of their mistakes and so forth. Pam could have had her own car at 5 years old if she had asked. She got a lot of things that nobody else got. Right? Over the years, my dad got to be a little more financially successful. We were able to go to summer vacations not far from Detroit. And I got to meet...
Still a mechanic at this time?
Dad developed some machinist skills, became a very skilled tool and die maker, and was able to open up his own business. He was able to live the American dream and own his own business, advance, and so forth. And so he had the financial wherewithal to allow us to enjoy some of the benefits. So we went from a broken down old car to a slightly newer car to eventually in 1960 he actually bought a new car. Right? In 1962 he took us on vacation to Canada, and we rented a cottage on Lake Erie, and our neighbors on one side were descendant of a long German family. Right? The grandfather was there who served in World War I, and the father who was an ex-United States Marine. Right? And they too had a very materialistic point of view from raising their children, but not to the extreme that my father did. Right? Their kids were allowed on vacation to sleep in a little bit. Right? Their kids were allowed to deviate from the routine, and I learned some of the things from that. And I would drag my father over and say, "Can you experience some of this?" All right. So over time, my parents changed. They adjusted. When they became grandparents, they were totally opposite from what they were as parents. They were very open, very, very forgiving, very, very generous to my children and so forth. My kids never believed my stories of what I endured when I was a child. They said, "Nah, Grandpa was never like that."
We will be right back. For nearly 2,000 years, Jews and Christians have been divided. But now, God is calling for the healing of past hurts and the comforting of His people. Discover how God is prophetically uniting Jews and Christians across the world today on The Crossover. The Crossover exists to communicate to the Jewish community that there is a growing group of Christians who love them unconditionally. The focus of the Crossover program is to promote a greater understanding of the differences and similarities between Jewish and Christian customs, history, and theology, while encouraging a closer walk with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As a second-generation Holocaust survivor, Rosalie's Jewish heritage includes parents who were protected from the Nazis by Christians. Yet for more than a decade, Mitch and Rosalie searched for meaning in life in the New Age movement. But after returning to their Judeo-Christian roots, they discovered God's purpose for their lives: to rebuild bridges between Christians and Jews. Now through TV, radio, the internet, speaking engagements, the healing room, and print and video resources, they are reuniting Jews and Christians in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Join Mitch and Rosalie as they tackle tough topics and welcome dynamic guests on The Crossover. The Promised Land.
And I also tried to make it very clear to the Christians all over the world that they are threatened to the same extent as the Jews and Israel are threatened. And I also say basically that Jews and Christians are waiting for the Messiah, who is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. And that Messiah is going to come to Jerusalem. And so Christians share this faith with the Jews.
The Hebraic roots of Christianity.
And we began looking at Jesus through Jewish spectacles and not our Texas spectacles or American spectacles or even Western culture spectacles. He's so much more glorious. He's so much more grand. It does not in any way detract from the fact that he's the Son of God, the risen Savior, but he's also a man.
Judaism 101.
Many times people ask, what is a Jew? Is it a race? Is it a people? Is it a culture?
Jewish-Christian relations. Bible, fact or fiction? For more information on the Crossover and the Crossover Project, contact Rosalie Jerome or log on to our website. Here is your host, Mitch Jerome.
Simon, mom and dad got a little softer. They're living the good life, literally the American dream, able to supply for you more. Now you're integrating with many other people. Was there ever a time where there was a warning, Simon, if they're not Jewish, don't hang out with them? Or was there ever a warning on other types of people, cultures, etc.?
My father, like so many other survivors, was leery of strangers. My father was leery of people that did not have similar backgrounds as his. And my mother, too, was also very leery. But as my parents became more integrated into the local community, into the Detroit community, they met other people that were not of similar backgrounds. And they realized that they couldn't hold on to this negative point of view. They tried to find ways to reach out and become more assimilated. One of the most important things that happened to me was Detroit had a race riot in 1967. All right, and we were living on a street that was mixed. There were white people or Caucasians, there were black people, and there were people from all over Europe living on that street. Right. My father had, prior to the riot, my father had back surgery, and he was in a body cast during that particular summer. Right. And we had some rifles and weapons in the house. But I was, 20 years old, didn't know my you-know-what from a hole in the ground as far as military and so forth. I was very much a part of that pacifism and peace movement and that was going on back then. And we heard from a neighbor that there were some houses not far from us that were being torched. We heard from a neighbor that there was some danger in the neighborhood, right? Because we were mostly white, but we did have some black families in the neighborhood. My father, who had made friends with some of these black families, all right, said, go out and talk to this particular one. He's ex-military, all right, and let him know about my back problem. All right. I went and saw this man, and we got to talking. And he came over to the house. He picked up one of my dad's hunting rifles. Right? He showed me how to use it and so forth. And then he picked out another rifle. And for 3 nights, he and I walked the streets of the neighborhood patrolling together, right, to make sure no harm came to our neighborhood. Right? And I would have been scared out of my mind if something had happened. But he had enough skill and enough ability to put a sense of confidence in me to walk up and down to be our neighborhood watch. But this black man was the one that initiated it. And my father was the one that told me to go ask him.
What are you doing as a group to reach out for this next generation so this is not repeated?
Unfortunately, right, we find that given the opportunity, history will repeat itself, right? And we have people out there now that are calling for the annihilation of the state of Israel, people that are calling for death to all Jews. What did we as a second generation? We were the leading edge of the baby boomer generation. We were born in 46, 47, 48. We were the ones that went out and said, we need more peace. We need more togetherness. We need more harmony. Many of us said it. A few of us actually acted that way and did what we could to bring that about. Myself, in my own little way, I try to do and make a difference wherever possible. I was an advisor to a young man's youth group, a young Jewish man's youth group. These gentlemen were way too homogeneous. They weren't exposed to the realities of the world. So they saw this one is this color, and this one is that color, and this one is that culture, and so forth. They saw the differences. And I felt it was my personal responsibility to show the similarities.
So out of 16 brothers and sisters that you could have had in your family, imagine only 3 being alive, and not because they died of car accident, not because of medical, but because of evil was able to get into a man by the name of Hitler, and he was able to march forth and just eliminate millions upon millions of people because he thought he was superior to them. How would you react to have your family just decimated like that? Well, people, it's time to rise up, because anti-Semitism is stronger now than it was during World War II. And people like Simon and second-generation people, and what this March of Remembrance is about, Jews and Christians coming together, is to say, never again will we allow evil to put its tentacles out like that without getting resistance, big resistance, from people that have values and morals and the ability to work together, different colors, different races, different religions, putting all that aside for the benefit of mankind. Thank you for watching The Crossover. These are prophetic times. God is at work. La Shalom.
To peace.
Join Mitch and Rosalie as they reach an ever-growing worldwide audience through The Crossover. We invite you to become a Crossover partner right now by calling the number on your screen. For your monthly gift of $30 or more, you will receive the Crossover Partnership Pack, which includes a DVD of today's program, a personal greeting and prayer message from Mitch and Rosalie, more information about the Crossover Project. As you continue to support the Crossover each month, you will receive a new Crossover DVD, a monthly ministry report, and your name will be added to the Healing Room. Call now or log on to our website and join the growing family of Crossover partners. And be sure to join us again next week as Mitch and Rosalie tackle timely topics and welcome dynamic guests on The Crossover.
Lord God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel.